Hi, it's Steve from PartSelect. Today we're going to show you how to change the lower hinge kit on your refrigerator, and it's a really easy job. All we're going to need is a Phillips screwdriver, a small flat blade screwdriver, a 5/16 nut driver, a 3/8 socket with an extension, and a 7/16 wrench. Let me show you how we do it. Now before we begin this repair, we want to verify that we have the right kit for your model. This hinge kit is used to replace the non-adjustable hinge kits on the side-by-side refrigerators in case you have doors that do not line up properly in the height. And they're also only for models that have the 2 paddles in the dispenser. So make sure that your refrigerator meets those requirements before you begin the repair. Next, we're going to start by removing the hinge cover on either door. It's held in place with a single Phillips screw. It's located at the back of that hinge cover. And remove the screw all the way and then push the hinge cover forward and then lift it off. Now there are 2 3/8 head bolts that secure that top hinge to the cabinet, so we'll need to remove those. But before you do, make sure that you remove all of the items on the refrigerator door first and set those aside. Then remove the bolts. You can next lift that hinge out of the door and just set that aside. Now we're going to take the refrigerator door off, and then we're going to set it on a suitable work surface so that we can replace the hinge bearing on the bottom of it. So just open it and lift it straight up, and then we'll set it aside. Now the new lower hinge bearing on the fresh food door is a little bit longer than the original. It's probably about 1/4 of an inch deeper. So once we remove the old one, we'll have to either dig out some of the insulation or press this into position enough that we can get it flush. Now just take a small flat blade screwdriver, and there'll be some slots along the edge of that lower bearing. You can just pry the old one out. And you can see that there is a difference in the height of them. Now the new one is held in place with one of the screws that secures the door stop. So we'll next need to remove that screw. That is a 5/16 hex head screw. And then we'll have to take that little flat blade and break through that insulation so we can gain that extra room that we need. And just press it into place, see if it will compress it enough. If not, we'll dig a little more out of there. Now make sure that we remove any of that excess insulation that we've dug out. And we'll take the hinge bearing, make sure that it does sit flush. We'll reinstall the mounting screw. Now before we reinstall the door, we're going to replace the lower hinge on the fridge cabinet. So we'll just set this aside, and then we'll next replace that lower hinge. Now next we're going to remove the kick plate. So we'll open the freezer door so that we can gain a little more access, and then just peel the top of that out with your fingers, or if you need to use a putty knife to separate it enough, and then it should just pop right out. And then we'll set that aside for now. And we're going to remove the bolts that secure that lower hinge to the cabinet. So with either a 3/8 wrench or a ratchet, we'll remove those 2 bolts. Now you may need an extension on your ratchet if you choose to use that to remove these 2 bolts, because the one that's tucked in underneath is a little harder to get to. Once you've loosened it enough, you can rotate that around and remove it the rest of the way. Then we can completely remove the old hinge and the door closer assembly and discard them. Now the new hinge is an adjustable hinge, so using a 7/16 wrench on the bottom of that hinge pivot, we could actually move that pin and raise it up, and we'll leave it in the lowest position to begin with. But you'll see that if you do need to adjust it, all we need to do is to remove the kick plate, and then using a 7/16 wrench we can adjust that pin so that it'll raise the door up. So next we'll reinstall those 2 bolts. We'll just start that one that's in underneath the bend of the hinge so that we can actually rotate the hinge around and line up the locating pin in the appropriate hole in the cabinet. And we'll install the second bolt. And again, you may find that easier to use a short extension on your ratchet. Now make sure that we tighten both of those bolts securely. And next we'll put the lower bearing in place. It has a pin in place of the screw that was used on the old one. There's a hole in that hinge that little plastic pin will fit down through, so slide it over the lower hinge, line up that pin and press it firmly until it bottoms out. Now we'll leave the lower kick plate off for now because we next need to do the conversion to the freezer door. And we'll carefully lift that door up and sit it down over the hinge, making sure that the hinge pin lines up with the hole in the bottom of the door. And if need be, have somebody assist you in locating that. Then just pivot the door into position, and the gasket should hold it closed while we put the top hinge on. So set the pin into the opening on the top of the door. We'll start the 2 bolts that secure that hinge. We want to take care that we line those threads up properly and don't get them cross-threaded. So you should be able to turn it in with your fingers most of the way. And we'll just snug them up just slightly. And then next we're going to adjust that door so that the gap is the same at the top and the bottom, and then tighten the 3/8 bolts securely. We're then ready to put the hinge cover on. So again, we'll make sure that the screw is pushed up through the opening. Set the hinge cap over the hinge, pull it back into position, and then replace the Phillips screw. And just tighten that up. Now if we need to adjust the height of the door, we can pull that bottom kick plate off and use a 7/16 wrench and raise or lower each door until we get them level across the top. Now to remove the freezer door, the first thing we'll need to do is disconnect the water line that is located at the bottom. So we'll simply open up the freezer door. We've already removed the kick plate, and we'll note the coupler that connects the tubing to the valve through to the tubing going up through the door. And to disconnect that, we're simply going to push in on that collet on top of that connector and then pull the tubing straight out of it. Now there will probably be some water spill at this point, so keep an old towel handy. Then we can just tuck that water line out of the way. We can reclose the freezer door. We should also remove any items that are on that freezer door as well. Now our next step will be to remove the screw that holds the hinge cover in place. It's a single Phillips screw located at the back of the hinge cover. So completely remove that screw from the cover, and then lift up and push forward on the hinge cover. We'll set that aside. And we'll note the wire harness that goes down into the door, so we'll have to separate that. Now there's a locking tab on that harness connector, so using a small flat blade screwdriver, we'll need to depress that tab. So locate that locking tab, and then just slide the flat blade into that opening, release the tab, pop that harness out. Now next we're going to remove the 2 3/8 bolts that secure the hinge to the cabinet. And next we'll just lift up on that hinge and tilt it around and set it on top of the door. Then we're going to take that freezer door and we're going to set it on a suitable work surface so that we can change the hinge bearing on the bottom. So open the door, and then carefully lift up on the door because we are going to be pulling that tubing up through the lower hinge. And if need be, have somebody assist you with guiding that up through there so that we don't bind it. And now we'll set it on a suitable work surface. Now with the freezer door set on a suitable work surface and we've got the face of it protected so that we don't scratch it, we're going to take a small flat blade screwdriver and then we'll go along the edge of that lower bushing and you'll see some slotted openings. We just put our screwdriver in there, and we're going to pry that old bushing out of the doorstop holder. And just pull it completely off of the door. We're going to take our new one, and it's a three-sided piece, so line up any of three different ways. And then we're just going to press that firmly into position. And if you need to, just tap it gently around the edge so that it sits flush on that doorstop plate. And take caution that we don't damage the water tubing coming out the bottom. And once we've got it mounted flush, we'll set that door aside, and then we'll go ahead and put the lower hinge on. Right now that we have the new bushing in the bottom of our door, our last step is to replace the lower hinge. It's held in place with two 3/8 bolts, just like the fresh food door. So we'll simply remove those two bolts. You might find it a little easier if you use a short extension with your ratchet. And there's one bolt that is tucked in underneath the top of that hinge. It's a little harder to access without the extension. Now we can remove the old non-adjustable hinge and closer assembly and set that aside. Now our new hinge looks a little bit different in that the post that the door sits on is adjustable. It's threaded, and with the use of a 7/16 wrench we can turn that enough to raise the door if required. So we'll again replace the two bolts. We'll just start that one that's underneath the overhang on that hinge, and then rotate the hinge around, line up the locating pin at the bottom on the hole in the cabinet. That assures us that it's in the proper position. Replace the second bolt, and then we'll tighten those with our ratchet. And next we'll put the door closer on. Where the old one was held in place with a single screw through the tab on the end of it, this uses a small cylindrical piece that will fit down through a hole. So simply slide it over the hinge pin, line it up with that hole, and press it firmly into place until it bottoms out. And as we mentioned, to adjust that height of that door, we'd simply put a 7/16 wrench on the bottom of that hinge pin and adjust the height as required. So we'll start with it in its lowest position until we have the door on and lined up with the fresh food door, and then we'll determine whether we need to adjust it. So now we're ready to put the door back on. Now when reinstalling the door, we want to make sure that we line up that water tubing through the opening in the lower hinge, and as well to make sure that we get it lined up straight with the cabinet. So you may need some help in guiding that tubing through the opening, because we don't want to kink that. And just rotate the door into position. Pivot the hinge back onto the cabinet, and replace the two bolts that secure that hinge. And we'll just turn those bolts in by hand at first so that we make sure we don't cross thread them. And tighten them with the 3/8 socket. And just snug them up to begin with. And then we'll check the alignment of the door with the side of the cabinet, and also with the space in between the Frigidaire and the fresh food door. Make sure that we have an even gap all the way from top to bottom. Once we have that straight, we'll tighten those bolts securely. Next we'll reconnect the wire harness, and again we'll make sure that we line up that locking tab with the other half of the wire harness connector. Make sure it's firmly pressed into place. We can then put the hinge cover back on. We'll slide it forward, center it, push it back into position, make sure it hooks on the front. And place the Phillips screw that holds it to the cabinet. Now next we'll reconnect the water line. So open up the freezer door so that we have good access to it. Check that tubing, make sure that there's no kinks in it. It has a nice clean end on it. We're just simply going to push it into that union connector as far as it will go. And then pull back on the connector to make sure it's locked in place. Next we'll put the kick plate back on. So open up the fresh food door as well. Then we're going to tuck that kick plate underneath the water line to make sure that we don't pinch it. Slide it around the hinge on both sides. And then we'll engage the bottom hooks over the lower frame. And then gently push down on the top ones while pushing in on the kick plate at the same time. Make sure it's snapped in position. Now the last thing we'll need to do is check the height of the doors, and if one's a little higher than the other, we'll raise the opposite door using our new adjustable hinge. We'll reload the freezer door and the fresh food door, and our repair is complete. I told you it was an easy job. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your repair.